This episode is sponsored by Kendo UI. Kendo UI allows you to build better apps faster. They have a comprehensive library ranging from data grids and charts to buttons and sliders. Plus, you can use their components as plain JavaScript as well as in Angular, React, and Vue. They have a large collection of customizable popular themes like Bootstrap and Material. Go check them out at javascriptjabber.com/KendoUI.
Hello and welcome to Views on Vue. Today on our panel, we have Fritz, core team member, contributor, and speaker.
Hi.
We have Eames, organizer of the Framework Summit.
Hey, everybody.
And I'm your host for today, Divya Sasidharan, Vue contributor and speaker. Joining us on our panel, we have Edd Yerburgh. Ed, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hey guys, yeah, thanks for having me. So it's Edd Yerburgh.
I'm so sorry.
Difficult to pronounce.
Divya never gets anyone get her name wrong.
Right.
Well, I've got a particularly difficult surname to pronounce. At least you didn't call me Eddie.
Yes, it's true.
So I'm a software engineer for the BBC in London, and I maintain Vue Test Utils.
Cool. Can you speak more about what Vue Test Utils is?
Yeah, sure. So Vue Test Utils is basically a library to help make unit testing Vue components easier. So when you unit test Vue components, you basically want to mount a component, and then you want to interact with the mounted component and check that it produces the right output. So Vue Test Utils provides some methods for you to mount a component with some options, and then some methods for you to interact with the mounted component instance.
Can you explain that concept, mounted component?
Yeah, so when you have a Vue component, it's basically just some options, right? Like a normal component, it's a JavaScript object with some options. But when you use it in a Vue application, it gets converted into a Vue instance. So if you've created a Vue application, you've probably written new Vue, right? Like what you're doing there is creating a Vue instance. Mm-hmm. And if you pass in the L option, under the hood, Vue uses that to find a DOM node and then mount the component, which basically sets it running and makes it render the virtual DOM tree that's used to generate the DOM nodes that are rendered in the DOM. So that's what mounting is. It's basically setting the component running.
So essentially, when you use Vue Test Utils, you're writing unit tests. Is that right?
Yeah, so I think Vue Test Utils is mainly for writing unit tests and snapshot tests.
So not for writing end-to-end tests?
No, not really.
And so if you were to use Vue Test Utils, would you use it by itself? Or would you have to use it with a test runner like Jest or Jasmine or Mocha?
So it's framework agnostic. You could use it with any test runner. But because we're mounting a component and generating DOM nodes, it needs to be run in a DOM environment. So if you're running them in Node with something like Mocha, then you're going to need to run JS DOM, which is a JavaScript implementation of the DOM. And Jest, which is the testing library that I normally use, by default, it runs test files inside a sandbox JS DOM environment. So it works with any framework, but I've found that it works best with Jest.
What works best with Jest? I'm curious.
Well, it's the easiest to set up with Jest, and because Jest runs everything in a sandbox environment, it means that if your test does have any side effects, like if it changes anything in the window, which is like needs to be the window needs to be running on the global object when you run these tests. So if you change anything on the window, then it changes that for all the future tests. But if you're using Jest, because it runs them in like a sandbox JS DOM environment, it only affects tests that are in the test file that you're running, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes sense. So it sort of makes testing easier in other ways for Vue components.
So it makes the setup a lot easier. So with Jest, there's like the zero config approach, and it's geared up for testing client-side code in a Node environment.
So can you speak more to examples of components and things that you would use to test with Vue Test Utils?
Yeah, so basically, say I had like a counter component, right? And I had a counter component that rendered a count value, and it had also rendered a button. And each time you click the button, it would increment the value by 1. So I could write a test that mounted that counter component and then dispatched a DOM click event on the button and asserted that the count value that was rendered incremented by 1. So that's like a simple unit test for a Vue component.
Got it. So like, what are good patterns to use when you're testing? Or do you have certain strategies that you particularly use when you're using Vue Test Utils or when you're testing Vue components?
So in general, I try to make it so that my unit tests don't tie myself to an implementation for the component, if that makes sense. So I try and, when I'm running tests, make sure I focus on just giving a component an input and then asserting against the output that the component generates. Because then I'm free to read back to the component to implement the behavior in a different way without breaking the unit test. So that's the first thing that I do when I'm writing unit tests. I think another thing is to consider what you should test, like, or if you should write unit tests for Vue components. So part of unit testing Vue components is deciding if you actually need to write the unit test in the first place.
Definitely. That's a very good question to ask. Do you have an answer to that?
Oh, so I wish I had a comprehensive answer. I've got some principles that I try and follow, but yeah, I think it's very difficult to give a definitive answer of when you should write a unit test and when you shouldn't. But
sure.
I mean, I think, for example, if a component has a lot of logic, then that's probably a good sign that you should write a unit test. Another good sign is if the code is hot, right? So if the code runs a lot in your test, in your application, or if people work on it a lot, if you've got like a component that's having a lot of features added to it, and that's a good candidate to have unit tests, because you're going to be running those unit tests often and getting the benefit of having written them.
So if it's a heavily utilized feature, then you might probably want to write a unit test for it. Yeah.
So I mean, so basically, right, when you're writing tests, you're spending some time writing the tests, and in the hope that the time you spend writing it is going to be, paid back in the time that you save in the future. So if you spend an hour writing a unit test, you want to save yourself in the future more than an hour's worth of time that you would have spent checking whatever that unit test is testing for you.
Completely. And in a sense, I think this was implied by what you're saying, is that the test in itself works as a form of documentation, because as a developer, you have insight into what a feature or piece of code does, having through and read the code itself.
Yeah, it's a lot easier to start working on a component if you can read through the test and see how it was intended to behave.
Completely.
You also talked about components with a lot of logic, right? So do you mean just like business logic, or what about like display and state type logic?
Yeah, so I think all of those things count as logic. So anything where you've written some code that maybe has multiple branches in it, ultimately generate some different output. So that output could be just adding a class name to an element, but it could also be sending a HTTP request or dispatching a store event. So I think any kind of logic that's complicated would benefit from a unit test.
Gotcha. So I kind of have a little bit of an implementation, or, a sort of a fine question here. Let's say I got a component that I'm doing a lot. It's, in the template as well as in the component, where let's say that I've got 10 different bindings, variables in there, and I've got a couple of conditional display areas as well. Should I write, let's say that exact example. I've got 5 bindings and I've got 2 different conditionals, right? Conditional display areas. Should I be writing like 1 test to test all of that, or 5 tests, or 7 tests, or 15 tests? Or should I be testing all that at all?
I think it depends on a few things. So firstly, you could probably capture a lot of that with snapshot tests as well as unit tests. But also, it depends if that component is going to be around for a while. Like if you're going to work on it in the future and add extra features, and you're going to have to check a lot that it's still working. Or if you've just written that component and you're probably never going to look at it again. And if you do, you can test all of its functionality within like 2 minutes of working on the browser. So I think it depends on, like I said, whether writing those unit tests is going to pay off in the future.
Mm-hmm.
And you just mentioned snapshot tests. Could you explain a little bit more about that? Like, what is a snapshot test, and when exactly would you use it?
Sure. So a snapshot test basically takes a snapshot of, or it takes some kind of serializable value, which is basically like any value in JavaScript that could be converted to a string, and it saves that value. And the next time that you run that test, it's going to generate a new value and then compare the new value to the old value. So, for example, you could mount a component that has, some HTML, generates some HTML. You could mount that component and create a snapshot test with the DOM node, and that's going to save. It's basically going to look like HTML. It's going to save a snapshot of that HTML, and then you change some functionality and run the test again in a week's time, and it's going to regenerate the DOM nodes and then compare it to the previously saved version and see if there are any differences. And if there are, then it'll throw an error because your new version isn't matching the saved snapshot that you're testing against.
So basically like automatically capturing strings of HTML and then just comparing those strings?
So you have to pass in the value that you want to snapshot test. And so you could like just compare just a random string. You can have like a test that calls a function that sums 2 numbers together and save a snapshot of that. And that could be your test. But with Vue components, I think it's really useful to create a snapshot with like the rendered, with the DOM node, which when in the actual snapshot, it looks like HTML.
So it's not just for visual snapshots. It's just
you can use it for anything,
right? But it's ultimately what it's comparing is a string. It's not comparing like an image.
No, so you used to have, or you still have ways of testing where you'll literally start your application and take an image of your application and save that, and then in the future, when the test runs again, it will do the same thing: start the application and compare the image to a saved image. But snapshot tests don't do that. They save string serializable values.
I guess you could save the image as a string, but like when it failed, you wouldn't. I don't know, unless you're much better at like reading, image binaries or whatever you would call them than I am. Then it might be difficult to tell what exactly is going wrong. Like, is this button the wrong color? Or that could be difficult.
And so, in order to perform a snapshot test, you would essentially be using Jest, or you'd be leaning on Jest for that functionality?
Oh yeah, so Jest has a really good snapshot implementation. I actually don't know any other frameworks that support snapshot tests like Jest does. But yeah, Jest includes a snapshot testing library, and you're basically, in your test, you're going to mount a Vue component using Vue Test Utils, and then call the Jest to-match snapshot matcher with the DOM nodes generated by the component. Gotcha.
And I noticed you're also requiring a library called Vue Jest. Can you speak more to that and that piece of Vue Test Utils and what exactly that does?
Sure. So Jest basically has its own module system under the hood. And that means that it also has to have its own compiling system to compile a JavaScript that wouldn't normally run in Node into JavaScript that does run in Node. So you can't use Webpack to compile for Jest. We haven't actually talked about that, but when you're writing Vue components, often you're writing single file components, and you can't run that that's not valid JavaScript. You can't run that in Node or in the browser. So you need to compile it before you can test it. So Vue Jest is basically a compiling library for Jest that converts Vue files into JavaScript objects. So you can compile single file components in Jest.
And so taking a step back, when you do testing in Vue, you can test using single file components where you're requiring a .vue file in your test. And there's also a second method where you are instantiating a Vue instance and then checking a value or whatever is rendered within that. What is the difference between doing it one way or the other, or is there any?
So when you say create instantiating a Vue instance, you mean still importing a component but instantiating an instance?
So not really. It's not really importing the component, more so creating, like if you do new Vue and then you just write the template yourself essentially. And so instead of importing single file component, you're creating that component within your test itself, like in a before each block, for example, which I've seen that is one way of doing tests where you're not extrapolating your component into separate. Like if you wanted to, I don't know, it's almost like a just for the sake of testing the thing, kind of.
So maybe like if you were testing a mix-in or something, you might make a fake.
Yes, exactly. If you're testing a mix-in or where you could just like pull in a specific template and then have that Vue instance render that specific template. Yes.
Yeah. So, I mean, that sounds... So if you're importing the component, then that's basically what Vue Test Utils is doing. Like you're going to import a component and then call mount, and under the hood it's basically calling new Vue. There are some extra steps.
Yeah.
So I mean, either way, you're achieving this. You're doing the same thing basically. You're creating a Vue instance in your test.
Got it. And so when you're creating or when you're using Vue Test Utils to do testing, there are specific additional methods that Vue Test Util adds to allow you to set data, for example, set props. Can you speak more to those methods and like the reasoning behind adding those to Vue Test Utils?
Yeah, so there's some methods like set props, and there's some we added recently like set value, which is something that you would use on an input element. So if you want to test an input element, you have to set the value of it directly. Like you have to get the element reference and then set the value. But if you've bound your data with vModel, you also have to basically force the vModel to update. So if you were writing this test yourself in pure JavaScript, you set a value of an input element, and then you have to dispatch a input event on that input to update the vModel value. So we've included a set value method that effectively does that under the hood. There are some other methods like set checked, which does a similar thing for checkboxes and radio buttons.
Got it. And so essentially those are, if you call it sort of sugar syntax over native functions, say vue.setData, vue.$setData, that allows you to set data to a Vue instance and so on. But it's just a wrapper around Vue Test Utils that allows you to do that same functionality.
Yeah.
Correct?
So So all Vue Test Utils is all of the methods. They're wrappers around, or most of them are wrappers around Vue and native DOM methods to do something like dispatch an event on an element or set the state of a Vue instance.
Got it. Okay. So if I wanted to, I could use set data, but if I felt more comfortable using the native way of setting data using Vue, I could do that as well. And they would both render essentially the same thing.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I have an interesting question that occurred to me. Can you actually test Vue components without using Vue Test Utils? Is that possible?
Yeah, you definitely can. So like what Divya was saying earlier, you basically just create a Vue instance yourself and then you can use like native Vue methods or traverse through the DOM yourself. But there are a few sort of gotchas that might trip you up.
What are those gotchas?
Is it a nice short, easy list?
So what I just described about when you set the value on an input, I don't think many people would think that you'd also have to trigger an input event to actually update the vModel bound value.
Because they don't realize that it doesn't happen like automatically when you just set value?
Yeah, I guess so.
And another utility that Vue Test Utils gives you that I really enjoy is create local view.
Yeah.
And I think that covers a big gotcha.
Yeah, definitely. Create local view basically makes like a scoped view constructor for you to change in your test. So it gives you a way to write scoped unit tests. Because under the hood, when you create a Vue instance, you're using the Vue-based constructor. And if you make changes to that, then every single future instance that you create is going to have those changes added to it. So it's like it's polluted with your values.
So for example, if you use Vue.use Vue router, now like every test is using Vue router, like whether you want it to or not.
Yeah. And Vue router, is especially bad because when you install Vue router on the base constructor, it adds router and root as read-only properties on the Vue prototype. So there's no way that you can ever override them for the rest of your tests, which just can cause a world of pain for people who don't know why they can't change these values or where it got set. So yeah, the solution is to always install plugins on a scoped local view, so you avoid polluting the base Vue constructor.
So would create local view then automatically destroy that Vue instance when that test finishes running, or like it just scopes it directly to that specific test?
So it just creates like another Vue constructor, and then when you pass it into the, so you have to pass it in the mounting options. And then Vue Test Utils will use that constructor to create the Vue instance.
Got it.
Something else that I was curious about, are there any common mistakes that you see people make in testing Vue components, with or without Vue Test Utils, that you'd like to talk about? Like anything that you frequently tell people, it's like, oh yeah, you can actually do this, and they didn't even realize it, and it makes their life a lot easier? So most of my interactions with people through the issues tracker on Vue Test Utils. And by far the most issues have to do with Vue router, which we just talked about. So I think it's the biggest mistake I see people making is installing everything on the base Vue constructor rather than using local Vue. And yeah, I don't really see too many other common mistakes. And maybe it's not a mistake, but a lot of people get confused about selecting DOM elements in tests. Like they don't know if they should add refs onto elements so that their tests are sort of almost agnostic of the actual tag that they're testing, or whether they should, add classes and IDs to make it so their tests are selecting elements without asserting the tag. So yeah, I see a lot of people getting confused about that. And I don't really have an answer. I think that it is quite difficult when you're writing client-side tests, when you're checking like an element as the output, because you are almost tying yourself down to an implementation detail when you're testing that, for example, a P element is rendered. Yeah, and when you say an implementation detail, like it's something that, like, if it was no longer rendering a P element, but it was rendering some other element, it's probably more likely that you decided to change it rather than that it broke.
Yeah, exactly. So, if you decide to change something from a P element to a span, you made that decision. It's probably not going to break your functionality, but now you're going to have to go and change your unit test.
So it just gives you more work to do, like every time you want to change that. And then people don't want to run their tests. So I was like, oh, maybe we'll just skip for now. And then the tests are basically useless because people aren't paying any attention to them.
Yeah, it's difficult.
Okay, so don't test implementation details, things that you're probably likely to change and doesn't necessarily mean the app is broken.
Well, I wouldn't necessarily say don't test implementation details. Let's just say try and keep your tests that do test implementation details to a minimum. Like, I think that sometimes it's very difficult to avoid checking a P element. Like, personally, I would rather not change my markup. Like, I would rather not add a ref to an element or a class to an element just to test it. I'd rather just check the tag and then have to change it in the future. But I think either way isn't ideal. So just try to keep tests that check the output of a component is in like the DOM output. Try and keep them to a minimum.
Yeah, I guess one middle ground that I sometimes find is like when I'm testing a form, for example, and the form has some validation. And so sometimes I want to test to see if there's a validation message that actually shows up. Then I'll look for like somewhere within this form, I see some element that contains this text. And I look for part of that validation message. So it might be, like password like must be present or something like that. And that's partly an implementation detail. Like I could change it to, like password must exist.
Yeah, so you're just trying to tie it as loosely as possible, but make sure that it is still testing what you wanted to test.
Yeah, the way that I try to think about it is like, how would I actually explain it to someone who's not technical? And then I try to test the thing that I would explain about like how this should work. Yeah.
Right. Okay.
Show a message, and the message should say this. And that way, like as soon as I start like bringing in details that are pretty technical, then I'm probably testing an implementation detail. And there are exceptions to that, but it's a general rule I try to follow.
I usually try to extrapolate details or implementation details as a whole. So, for example, you're talking about form validations. If I wanted to know that a validation message should be here, I could just create a slot where the message should be, and then like make sure that message shows up, and then check that the slot has content, for example, because I know that slot always has and should have a specific message. But I don't really care what the content of the message is. I just want to make sure that there is a message there, for example. And that abstracts away the actual implementation details per se, but that content is there. That's one way of doing it, I guess.
Yeah, I like doing that too. That's a good idea. Like breaking things down into like smaller components so that like you can trust that the validation messages work because those are tested separately.
Exactly. Yeah. So it circles back to what Ed was mentioning, where you're breaking down your test to the smallest possible unit, and you're testing that so that it's very clear what exactly you're testing for, and it's tied directly to a very specific part of your application. And so you don't have to worry about your test breaking when like another part of your application breaks, because it's tied specifically to one piece of it, rather than like being convoluted and mixed in with other pieces. And so we didn't talk about this much, but I'm curious if someone were to you talked about using Vue Router with Vue Test Utils. What is the steps or the process for using Vuex with Vue Test Utils? If you were to check that a component that uses Vuex is getting specific data and so on.
So there are a few different ways to do it. You could, like if your store isn't actually doing anything asynchronous, you could just literally create a store using your real store config and pass that into the component as it's mounted. And that can be good if the store is fairly simple and like easy to follow. And then you can test the whole life cycle. So if you're updating something in the store and then the component does something in response to that, then you can test the whole life cycle without actually checking that it's dispatching an action or committing a mutation. But it depends. Okay. So you might have to just mock the store out or create a running store, but only with a select few values, and then just check that the component renders correctly using those values. Or there are lots of different approaches. I think that my general approach to testing is try to do as little mocking as possible. But the more mocking you do, the less realistic your tests are. And the more chance there are for your tests and your production code to get out of sync.
Yep.
So if you can get away with using a full Vuex store in your test, then I would do that.
But if you say you wanted to, let's say, make an API call, which is asynchronous, then you mentioned a little bit about this, that the process by which you test when you're doing things asynchronously is different from when you're doing things synchronously. Can you explain what that means?
Yeah, so when you're testing something asynchronously, you have to change your tests. So by default, most test runners have synchronous tests. Now, if you want to do something async in your tests, you're going to have to change the test to run asynchronously. And there's a few different ways you could do that. Like, older way of doing it was to use this callback that's passed into tests. So there's like a done callback, and you would, wait for whatever async action was happening and then call done once you've run your assertion.
Deploy more, pay less with DigitalOcean, the simplest all-in-one cloud computing platform for developers. Scale and run cloud applications faster and more efficiently with effortless administration tools to robust compute, flexible configurations, networking services, real-time alerts, and rapid provisioning, while enjoying industry-leading price to performance with a flat pricing structure across all global data center regions at any usage volume. Spend more time building better web apps and less time worrying about managing infrastructure with DigitalOcean. Build your next app on DigitalOcean. Get started with a free $100 credit at do/co/viewsonvue.
But yeah, now that you have async await in Node, you can use some helper libraries to basically wait for the next tick. Because most of the time when you're testing async, you want to mock anything that's truly asynchronous, like HTTP calls that could take seconds. So you want to mock everything out and make sure that everything is either a resolved promise or, so you basically want to make sure that everything's just a resolved promise, which is still asynchronous, but it happens on the next tick. So there's loads of helper libraries that you can use that basically wait until that next tick's happened, and then you can run your assertion and test that whatever you wanted to happen has happened.
So you can't currently do that with Vue Test Utils. You would have to pull in another library like that allows you to handle promises or allows you to mock promises for you to.
As well, so it depends what you need to do. Like if you're if you want to, I don't know, if you're injecting like a wrapper around Axios, for example, in your components, and that's how you do HTTP requests, then you could mock that. You could pass in a fake version with Vue Test Utils and test it that way. But Vue Test Utils doesn't include methods for waiting until all the pending promises have been flushed, for example, or for running asynchronous tests. If you're actually running an asynchronous test, that code is handled by the test framework that you're using.
Got it. But by default, if you were to update data in Vue Test Utils, it still goes through lifecycle methods and is able to update appropriately. And so only in the event that you're making like an async call using promises, for example, then you could still like mock that functionality and still get the lifecycle effects that you would expect. Is that correct?
Sort of. So Vue Test Utils. So Vue by default performs DOM updates asynchronously. Like it batches DOM updates and then it runs them on the next tick. And when we started working on Vue Test Utils, we decided that we'd make it run synchronously, because when you've got multiple DOM updates happening in a test, you end up with like pretty ugly tests where you're waiting for lots of things to happen. And just writing async tests is just more work. Like there's more chance for you to write tests that pass even though the assertion hasn't run, for example. So we went with the decision to make it so that all the DOM updates happen synchronously. And the original way that we did this was basically by running all of the render watches with an update function that Vue Test Utils included. And we would call that function after any method that interacted with the instance was called. So if a trigger was called that might have ultimately caused some data to change, which means that the DOM should update, we would call update in Vue Test Utils.
Yeah.
But we've moved away from that. But the implementation that we have at the moment, so the implementation we have at the moment is basically we set all watches to be synchronous. And that basically means that everything updates synchronously. But what we found out recently is that there are a few edge cases where it doesn't. Basically, you don't get the behavior that you expect to get from updating the DOM. So at the moment, the Vue Test Utils is still in beta, and this is like the big problem that we need to solve before we release it in version 1.0.
What are some of the edge cases that running your watches synchronously introduces?
So it's basically if you've got lots of watches, if you have too many watches, then it takes so long for the update to happen. Or so we set the watches to be synchronous, and recently there's an edge case where there was a guy who had I think it was an insane amount of watches, I don't know, 30,000 or 40,000 watches.
Oh wow!
And,
holy cow!
Yeah,
jeez.
From some library that he'd added. So basically, in that case, we just ran out of memory. We ended up in a infinite loop, which was pretty bad.
Yeah.
And the other edge cases are basically just certain, if you have multiple watches that rely on each other, there's a couple of cases where that means that the DOM doesn't update as you'd expect.
I see.
So yeah, at the moment, I've got a pull request open in Vue to actually add an async option, which would make it so that Vue Test Utils could turn off the asynchronous updating in Vue core, and we'd effectively get synchronous updates without any of the edge cases and bugs. But that is actually slightly problematic because that's only going to exist in Vue 2.6. So hopefully everybody's going to be able to go up to 2.6. But if they can't, then they're not going to be able to get the non-buggy version of sync updating. So there's some discussion at the moment about whether we should keep our buggy implementation or put out a warning basically saying that in a few months, anyone below Vue 2.6 isn't going to get synchronous updating. So you should turn it off now and refactor your tests to wait for DOM updates. And yeah, we haven't decided what to do yet.
That's interesting. How do you go about, as someone who is a maintainer of an open source library that's widely used, how do you go about making those decisions? How do you decide what goes in your library? For example, making the decision to make all of Vue Test Utils synchronous, for instance, what is the process by which you go through figuring that out or making that decision? Or is
so to make it all synchronous, so when we originally decided to build a library, there was basically a big kickoff thread with 100 comments from lots of different people. And we ended up with the an API similar to what we have now. And yeah, there isn't too big of a change. And that was when we decided that we'd run everything synchronously. At the moment, we have an issue open to discuss what we should do going forward with the synchronous issue at the moment. And yeah, I'm not going to make a decision until I've spoken to some more people who are relying on the library and got their opinions. And
so the way you go about figuring out whether something is good or not for the library is to poll the audience or poll your community and see what exactly they're looking for and get their feedback, essentially.
Yeah, that's basically it.
Okay.
It's quite difficult. I'll create an issue, but it's difficult to get users to engage, because I guess they're not really coming to the issue tracker unless they've actually got a bug that they found, or they got a feature request. So sometimes it will be months before I get some input on some of the questions that I've had for the design.
It's always fascinating because whenever you ask, especially, I mean, open source is a bad rap for this, because it's like when you open the floodgates, so to speak, about and ask the community what exactly they want, there's a lot of feedback, a lot of good, a lot of bad. And how do you filter through all of that to figure out what is the useful comments, or like the things that you can actually use or that is beneficial to the library itself? Because there are so many people with opinions. How do you filter all of that information?
So I'd say most of the time there's a like prevailing opinion. Like often a lot of people feel some way and it's not too controversial. But for example, we did have quite a controversial, we made a controversial decision to remove a set computed method. So you spoke earlier about how we have some methods where you can set the state or the props of a Vue instance. Yeah. And we originally also had a set computed where you could set a computed value. But the way that we implemented it was very difficult to implement. So we basically had to put the component into a state that it wouldn't normally be able to get into, if that makes sense. So we basically have to set the computed value permanently, and it wouldn't change again in the future. So
you can't change it after you set it. I see.
Yeah, so you wouldn't be able to change it after. So if you had a component and the computed value was supposed to change after you had set it, it wouldn't do that.
Oh, there's a problem. So
I can't remember who raised it as a concern. I think it might have been Thorsten, Linus Borg.
Mm-hmm.
And but he basically raised it somewhere. Maybe it was in the issue tracker. But quite a few other people came forward, and I also agreed with him. So we made an issue, and then a lot of people came and said that they really didn't want us to remove it. Like they relied on it or used it a lot in their unit test. There was a lot of kickback. Like I think that initial post had more dislikes than it had thumbs up, which is a sign that you're going against the grain.
Yes.
But I think in that case, you just had to make a decision of we don't want to have this feature that can cause so many problems and where we're putting your component into an unnatural state.
And something that a group of people that aren't represented in those discussions that I think are important to think about are newcomers. For every piece of API that you add, for every different utility that you add, that's something that may show up in people's apps that people learning to use Vue Test Utils will have to understand.
True. So how do you decide what would be good for those people?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's ideal to keep things as slim as possible and just keep the things that add the most value. But even for things like set value, which we were talking about earlier, what it does is it's not that much, but it does also work around a gap in knowledge that a lot of web developers have and that they don't realize when you set something with input.value equals new value, that it doesn't automatically trigger an input event in HTML. And so that's how it's making it easier for newcomers, even though it makes them learn a new thing. that isn't already part of Vue.
Yeah, and a lot of people actually also think that if you dispatch an input event with a value, that updates an input's value. So a lot of people report bugs where they like trigger an input or a key down or some kind of event on an input with a value, and they expect that's going to update the actual value, but it doesn't.
Yeah, because they misunderstand like how the DOM API actually works.
Yeah.
I think there's also an interesting trade-off that you make when you create a library, which is how much do you want to handhold your users, and how much, for example, this having to update, like for example, if you update an input event, you have to trigger the input in order for that to update. That is fairly common knowledge, or at least that's something that is in the DOM API itself. And so when you have something like set value or set checked or so on, that allows the user or newcomers to understand how to do it without, like getting all these bugs. But at the same time, it also can be a crutch because they won't know that like the real way of doing it, or not the real way, but the original way that you would do it is you would set the input and then trigger the input. So is there do you make that trade-off, or how do you make that trade-off when you're creating the APIs for Vue Test Utils?
So with set value and set checked and set selected in particular, basically just had a lot of issues from people who couldn't figure out how to set the value of a form and update the V model value. Because you can set the value of the form by just setting it, and then that's the new value. But to actually update the V model bound value, you need to trigger an event, and it depends on the element. So it's like for a checkbox, you have to trigger a changed event. I think you have to trigger a changed event for an option if you're setting an option in select to be selected.
Yep.
So that was like, there's probably like 5 or 6 issues with lots of comments of people trying to figure out how to do that. Mm-hmm. So in that case, I think the way I decided was by there being demand for people wanting to know how to do it.
And so do you add that note in the documentation? I haven't looked too deeply into this, but I'm curious if that is something that you add in the docs just as a way of like, hey, this is a method that you can use in order to trigger an input update. But like, if you want to do it, like this is actually what it's doing under the hood, so that people understand like what exactly the library is doing. And
yeah, it's funny you say that, because so we released set value last week.
Yeah.
And wrote the docs up last weekend as well. And basically we didn't add that information, but one of our contributors made an issue suggesting that we do. And I agree with him. So we're now going to add some details on that. But originally we didn't. But yeah, I think you're right. Like a little hint or just a short sentence that gives people enough information to go off and investigate if they want to. I think that's a really good way of writing the docs. Yeah, that's what I loved about Vue's docs actually when I first started reading them. Was it like, it was simple, but for some things it would give you links or a bit of direction of where to research to find out more. Yeah,
it's very beginner friendly, but not prohibitive if you want to get deeper and more advanced in your knowledge and to go a little further, which I think is where a library really shines, if it can do that, because then people will really want to get engaged with that specific tool or that specific API. And that's really, really great. And I've seen a lot of beginners really appreciate that, because they're like, I understand it and I could use it immediately. And then like, as they advance in their understanding of the specific thing, they're like, oh, it can do this and it can do this and it can do, and it's wonderful to see that path that they take.
So I have a question. Vue Test Utils, it's still in beta, right?
Yeah.
So that means it's like not done or not stable?
Yeah, it's not stable.
So like what's not stable about it? Like what is sort of still in flux? Like what do you still plan to add before releasing? Like that kind of thing. What are the future plans in current state?
So to get it released, in my eyes, there's only 2 things you need to do. One is finalized the scope slots API. So we added recently the ability to pass scope slots into the mounted component. And I'm not sure...
Similar to the slots option?
Similar to the slots option, but it only takes a string. And I think we could maybe improve it to take like a component, for example. Like at the moment, you can't pass a Vue component in. I don't know. I think that we need to look at the scope slots option and like finalize it before we release. But that's relatively small. The biggest thing is to decide on what we're going to do with synchronous updating. Like I said, I think that we're going to make a change to Vue core and then use that. But we have to decide whether we're going to have like a different API effectively for people who are using Vue less than 2.6, which isn't ideal, or whether we're going to have a buggy implementation. So we need to decide on that. So I'm hoping to get it released in the next couple of months.
I guess those people could always like stick to a previous version of Vue Test Utils.
Yeah.
So we could encourage people to use like, this beta version while they still need to, like, while they're still working on migrating to 2.6. But like, yeah, for me personally, like migrating to 2.6 isn't that big of a deal. It's not like you have to make huge changes to your application.
Yeah, exactly. It's not a breaking change, right? So unless you're digging into the internals, you should just be able to upgrade and it'll be fine.
Mm-hmm.
That's what I'm thinking. It just feels a bit strange having that big of a different behavior between different versions of Vue. But I guess it's probably fine.
Yeah, I mean, I think like we could even just like show a little warning saying, hey, it looks like you're using Vue, version da-da-da-da-da. If you're using before 2.6, you actually need to use this, and then we quit.
Yeah, that's like exactly what I would
we just like throw an error that says that.
Throw an error. So yeah, you can't use it unless you use Vue 2.6.
Yeah, I mean, that way it's easier for you to maintain, and I think that might be better for users overall.
It could be.
Because
at the moment, we run all of our tests against each minor version of Vue because there are like small differences between the internals. So we have to run tests against all the versions, but it definitely makes it more time consuming to develop when you're supporting each of those versions when you're using some internals sometimes.
I also feel like,
yes, sorry, go ahead. On the version.
I was just going to say, I also feel like the people who are like serious about tests are also going to be the people who are serious about keeping their dependencies up to date.
Yeah, true.
Like, generally, like those are going to be people who are going to want to like keep up to date with the latest Vue anyway, generally speaking. At least that would be my thinking. And I think it's been my experience, like in working with people through consulting.
Yeah, I think it should be the case. I know that people have been stuck on minor versions before because they've relied on some internal property in like a vnode or an instance that's changed. But yeah. But
those are usually like small things, not like something that's spread throughout their application. And if it is something spread throughout their entire application, it's kind of their fault.
Won't we also potentially see more and more people that as apps get more stable and mission critical and they get more of them, that they start being, and maybe the apps themselves get less features and themselves get more stable, that you get stuck on versions and you get less resources to keep up to date with the latest version. You get a little bit more nervous that a minor version is released. You don't want it to break. And so then you can start seeing people more and more stuck on minor versions.
Yeah, I do want to stress though that if people are upgrading to from a minor version and like, they're not accessing like APIs that are not public, and the vast majority of people like do not ever try to do that, and we make it very clear that if people are accessing those APIs, they are on their own. Then they shouldn't encounter breaking changes. So it should really only be like the super power users who want to like dig into mega internals. And in often cases, like when they feel like they need to do that, it's because they're doing something wrong. In a lot of cases that I've seen, there's actually a much simpler solution that they could be using. And they're doing this as sort of like an over-engineered hack, like making their life much harder and more complicated. because it seems the simplest to them at the moment. Like it seems like the most straightforward solution to just learn more about this underlying API. I was curious if there were any major bugs
in Vue Test Utils.
Yeah, that people need to know about. If they're going to use
just the synchronous bug that we spent a lot of time talking about. That's the only major bug. There is another thing. It's not really a bug, but it really sucks. So basically, at the moment, we can't really treat functional components as components. Like you can't call the methods like set props or even props. You can't get the props of a functional component because like we can't actually access that from the V node
because it has no instance.
Because it has no instance. So that's a shame. I don't know if there's anything we can do about that. We were talking about making a change in the core to have some access, maybe to like the original render context, or some way of accessing, or maybe if you had the original render context, then you could re-render the functional component to change the props. But that requires a change in the core, and I think that's quite an annoying feature of Vue Test Utils at the moment.
Yeah,
because you could have your tests written for a component, and then you could change it to a functional component, and now you can't test that component is receiving the correct props anymore because of the limitation of Vue Test Utils and functional components.
Yeah, I mean, I guess functional components are stateless, so it makes sense that you can't like test the state in some ways.
Yeah, true.
I guess that you do want, but really, like it's just like input and output. So you can give it input and you can test its output, but you can't reach it.
If you want to check that you're rendering it with the correct props, for example, like if you just want to write a test that asserts that you've written this, you're rendering this component with the correct props rather than what it's actually rendering. I think that's a fairly common use case.
I actually don't like doing that.
So I probably wouldn't do that either, but I know that people do try to do it and they get confused that they can't do that.
I mean, because that's something that it doesn't typically like break. If I have a computed property or something that I'm like passing as a prop, like I'll test that computed property rather than like testing what I passed to that component, because the part that's likely to break is like the computation. It's not like, did I type this correctly? Which will just like throw an immediate error if like there's not like, if I make a typo in the computed property, then it's likely I'll be referencing something that isn't actually a property on the instance, and then I get an error. So I'll know immediately. So like that's the part that's least likely to break to me.
Yeah, but people test it and then they'll change their component from a non-functional to a functional component, and then the test breaks. So I mean, one solution would at the moment, like even when you shallow render, you have this problem. But we could change it. We could change the code so that when you shallow render, you can check the props of a functional component. But I don't know if that's if it's good having a different API like that between shallow and a shallow mounted render tree and a mounted render tree.
And on my teams, I just tell people not to do that.
But I mean, it's a valid way of testing. I think a lot of like Airbnb, for example, I know that they, at least some of their teams, they don't actually run any end-to-end tests. They just run shallow unit tests for all of their components. And like they have a component library that's unit tested, and then they'll pick those components out, and pretty much the test will just check that the components are rendered with the correct props. And like, it does something in reaction to DOM events. But I think like that is a valid way of testing if you want to test like that. I mean, I don't personally, but it works for some people.
Yeah, I just think it's like it feels to me like a little bit wrong. Like it's incidentally testing what you want to test, but it's also testing something else that like you don't actually care about.
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult, and also makes it really difficult to refactor as well if you've got hundreds of unit tests just checking that a component renders another component. Like, it makes it.
Yeah, and then if you decide to use another component.
If you want to split that component out
like,
into several other components, then it's not a very inviting.
Yeah, it does kind of feel like not exactly the right way to solve the problem to me, but
yeah, I think that's a gotcha, I'd say. But apart from that, yeah, the bugs at the moment are just to do with synchronous rendering. Synchronous updating, and we're going to work on that. Get 1.0 released, and then in the future, the next thing to do is to move the whole repo to TypeScript. So I'm really looking forward to that. Mainly because it's going to keep So mainly because it's going to keep the type definitions in sync with the actual API, which I find is quite hard to do at the moment. Like, I often forget, or the type definitions get out of sync, or they're not completely correct sometimes.
Right now they're an extra step, like updating documentation. And this
so it's easy to sometimes forget, and it's hard to check, but you can't automate it. But if the whole repo is written in TypeScript, then the type definitions are going to be the live versions, which would be really good.
And those type definitions are really useful for like VS Code users who like can automatically see when they're pulling in methods, like what the API is, like what like for create local view, like what arguments it accepts and what it returns.
Yeah, definitely. Because at the moment we're using Flow, which is okay, but I think the traction's with TypeScript now. Like, I don't think it was obvious which was going to be the more popular way of adding types to JavaScript, but at least in the Vue community, it seems like most people are using TypeScript. There's demand for type definitions.
Do you run your own freelance business? Or maybe you're thinking about picking up some business on the side? Well, then you need FreshBooks. FreshBooks is the quickest and easiest way to get invoices out to your clients. It's easy to use. It works anywhere, available from any device, on the desktop, iPhone, iPad, Android, and all of your data is backed up and secure. And it makes it really easy to get organized and get paid. You'll be tracking time, logging expenses, and invoicing your clients in no time. You can also save time billing, freeing up several days per month to focus on the work that you love, and you get paid faster. FreshBooks customers are paid on average 5 days faster because there's a link on the invoice that says pay me now. And it's a great way to grow your business. Plus, FreshBooks is offering a 30-day trial. That's right, 30-day trial if you try them out. So go to gofreshbooks.com/devchat and enter devchat in the How Did You Hear About Us section. Once again, for a 30-day trial, go to gofreshbooks.com/devchat and enter devchat in the How Did You Hear About Us section.
It broke out too much, Divya. We heard it. You're wondering if the decision, if you type it into the chat, I can ask
Yeah.
it.
Was the decision to move to TypeScript driven by the community?
Yes.
Yeah, I think the Vue 3 is probably going to be written in TypeScript. So that was a big factor. But yeah, also it just makes sense because of how many people are using TypeScript for Vue Test Utils. It makes more sense for us to be using TypeScript to do the type checking so that we can keep it in sync with the API, like I was saying. Whereas I think we've had one request maybe for the flow types. So yeah, it's partly driven by the fact that Vue 3 is going to probably be written in TypeScript, and also by the fact that we want to keep our type definitions in sync. And the users of Vue Test Utils, TypeScript's definitely more popular.
Gotcha. So I hope this goes through. If someone were to want to contribute to Vue Test Utils, how would they go about doing that?
So basically, go to the repo, check the issue tracker, and either find a bug that they'd like to fix. Probably not the best way to start contributing, actually, because it might involve a lot of digging around in the code base. But or maybe find a feature that has an intend to implement label, and look into how you could do that. Ask questions if you have any. Open a PR as soon as possible, and then I can look over it and give you any advice or tips on where to go. But there are lots of other active contributors who will review PRs and give advice. So yeah, that's the best way to get started.
Cool.
And also, people don't normally think of it as contributing, but like getting involved in feature requests and like discussions about the API, that's really valuable. So if you want to contribute, but you don't have the time to implement a feature, just coming along and getting involved in some of those discussions is really useful.
That's a really good point. Are there any other final questions before you wrap up?
I have sort of a personal question.
Go for it.
Right now, I think CSS compilation wasn't working very well for a while, and an option was added to disable it. And that's what I use in my applications right now. But I haven't actually checked back in a little while in the last few releases, whether it's working better now.
No, is this Vue Jest?
Yeah, this is for Vue Jest. Yeah, sorry.
So we extract the classes now and add those. But yeah, I think it's working well. I think that for extracting the classes from the SCSS and stylus, I think that it's fine. We don't actually compile the CSS though. I don't think we're ever going to do that. We just parse it and then get some of the add the class attribute to the Vue instance. I think it's a class. I actually haven't worked on this in a while, but I think that you add, you can have like class properties on the Vue instance. You might know this best than me, Chris.
Whether you can have class properties in the Vue instance? What do you mean exactly?
I don't know. I'm keep confusing myself. But basically, we do support compilation of CSS, and I think you can have dynamic classes defined in your CSS, and that gets added to the Vue instance, and we do that.
Oh yeah. So like with modules, for example, like those are dynamic classes.
Yeah. So we do that, but we don't actually compile the CSS, or we do, but only to extract those dynamic classes,
so that you don't get undefined property.
Yeah,
that makes sense. So basically, to keep things from breaking.
Yeah, basically. Because we could like compile the CSS and like I guess do what Webpack does, but
what I've been doing for CSS modules is just setting it to an empty object, and that's actually good enough.
Yeah, we do that as well.
Like or set like $style to an empty object.
Yeah, but yeah, that's supported in Vue Jest now, so you should be able to remove the warning or the flag.
Excellent. I'll experiment with that, and then I may open up an issue. For anyone else listening right now, also the latest version of Vue Test Utils, I don't remember off the top of my head what exactly it was, but in beta 18, right, that's the latest version right now as of recording, it doesn't quite work. There was something that was broken for me, so I have to lock to beta 17. But I know there's already an issue for whatever the problem was, and Edd's on the case.
I was hoping you weren't going to bring that up, Chris.
Huh?
I was hoping you weren't going to bring up the.
Well, I wanted to bring it up in case people ran into it.
Well, we're actually on beta 19 now, so hopefully that bug's fixed for you.
Oh, you fixed it? Oh, beautiful.
Yeah, fixed a bug.
You fixed a bug. Well, I'll test beta 19, and you, dear listeners, can too. Remember, this is beta software. Like, in order to innovate, we make mistakes sometimes, and that's okay.
I'm curious about using TDD with Vue Test Utils. Does that work fine?
So, yeah, I think that it works well. I follow TDD often when I write applications. And yeah, you can totally do it with Vue Test Utils. I think that following strict TDD, when you literally write a test before every single line of code, doesn't really work when you're adding presentation or markups. Like if you're writing a test that checks that you render a div with the correct class, I don't think that works very well. But what you can do is just write, figure out the core functionality of a component, write some tests, or write a test, watch it fail, make it pass. Do that until you've got the logic of your component, and then basically write all of add all the markup without writing any tests. And if you want to, you could add a snapshot at the end to make sure that the markup that you did add doesn't change. There are no unintended changes to that in the future. So yeah, I think you can do TDD, but if you try and follow it strictly, as in you believe that you shouldn't write a single line of code without having a test for it, I think that you'd end up with a very unmaintainable code base.
Yeah, I do something.
Not unmaintainable, but it would take you a long time to rewrite the tests.
I do something similar when I have to do some kind of prototyping. Like when I don't already have in my head exactly like what the component is going to be like and how it's going to work, then I can't do TDD because even my initial idea of how it's going to work is probably going to change.
Yeah, that's the thing, right? TDD, it kind of assumes that you know the specifications before you write the code. But if you don't know the specifications, as in you don't know how you're going to implement the feature, then it's difficult to follow TDD.
But there are some cases where like it can be pretty straightforward. So for example, if you have a component that like accepts like Markdown and renders some HTML, that's something that is very straightforward, like what it should do.
Yeah.
And so that's much easier to test. And that's much easier to do TDD with, because like you know exactly what it's going to do. You're not going to think like, oh, should I have a button or should it actually be a checkbox? And
yeah, definitely. But even if you knew exactly what you're going to write, I still don't think that you. I mean, firstly, if you know exactly how you're going to style your component, then you're a CSS genius in my book, because every time I write some CSS and then I look in the browser, it never comes out quite how I expected it to.
I feel that same way.
Yeah. So, yeah. If you can write all of that and never change it and get it perfect, then TDD for your markup and adding classes and styling might work. But yeah, I think just following it to add the core functionality to components works well if you know the specifications.
Cool. And then my final question was, is there some kind of example or sets of examples that you recommend where people can see like a realistic application that has tests and like has realistic components to see like what like good tests might look like?
So that's a great segue into one of my picks, which is my book that I've been writing, Testing Vue.js Applications. So I've written a book, and as part of that, I have built a Hacker News clone with tests, and that's on GitHub, so anybody can look at that. So if you want to look at that repo, you could just go to github.com/Edd Yerburgh, if you know how to spell my name, and then Vue-Hacker News, and there's a Hacker News clone with unit tests, snapshot tests, and end-to-end tests.
And by the way, I can almost guarantee you, dear listener, that you do not know how to spell his name. It is actually, it is EDDYERBURGH. So, while we say Yar, it sounds more like Yer, which is why everyone, or it looks more like Yer, which is why everyone calls him like Yerburgh.
It looks like yeah. There's no way.
I mean, to people who aren't used to, your name in your region, I guess.
I don't think anybody's ever pronounced it correctly the first time, because
anybody?
Like you said, no, because I don't know. It's a bit strange, right? Like it's YER, but you pronounce it Yar. But I don't know any other word that I can compare that to. Like the final part of it's borough, and I can say, like Edinburgh. It's a similar sound, right? It's spelled the same way. I can't think of a single word where the ER makes an R sound.
I think your family just decided they weren't posh enough. so they had to posh up that first syllable.
Well, the thing is, right, historically, it was spelt with an A, and somewhere along the line, somebody decided to remove the A and use the E instead. So I don't know if that was a typo somewhere a few hundred years ago that's
so
gone
funny.
down the line. But,
Historic typo.
But you're sticking with the original pronunciation.
I'm sticking with the original pronunciation, yeah.
All right.
Great.
Now that we've covered final questions, we can move on to picks. Joe, do you have any picks for us?
Yeah. Yes, I do. All right. I recently tried out a new product called a Rocketbook, which is like this reusable notebook where you just write in it. You have to use these kind of special pens. You can erase it, but before you erase your notes, it's like an erasable notebook, but before you erase them, they have an app where there's a little QR code in the corner. You take a picture of the notes that you took, and then you can, along the bottom, kind of check a bunch of different check marks, and it'll automatically either take your notes and email them to you or put them in your Evernote or in a Google Drive, or there's a bunch of other locations. It's called Rocketbook. It's kind of cool. I'm trying to figure out actually a real flow for using it in my life, but I've been trying it out, and so far I'm pretty impressed with their implementation. And so I'm going to pick that Rocketbook. And I also watched a recent YouTube video that I found pretty interesting. It was called the VS Code Top 10 Pro Tips. And if you just hit that up on YouTube, just that string, you'll find it. But it's actually got a bunch of really good tips for using Visual Studio Code. And I've been using Visual Studio Code for quite a while. And they listed quite a few things that I wasn't either aware of or were kind of new to me. So those will be my picks.
I'll have to check that out.
Yeah, that's a good one.
Is that related to the video series that Sarah Drasner was creating on like things you didn't know about Visual Studio Code?
Is that the VS Code can do that?
Yes,
no, I think
VS Code can do that. Okay.
Like it's totally different people. So
okay.
I haven't watched much of the VS Code can do that. So I imagine maybe there's a lot of stuff that's similar, but it's just this guy's personal stuff like, hey, here's these 10 things, but they're really good. So
we'll have to check that out.
Yeah.
Chris, what are your picks?
So before the show today, we were talking a little bit about sleep. Last night, Joe didn't get quite as much sleep as he wanted, and I sometimes find myself in the same situation. And so I wanted to share a few tips for sleep, things that like work for me that I found that may work for you, they may not work for you. The first one is that I've noticed if I keep working after 10 p.m., and when I say working, I mean like doing something creative. It doesn't have to be billable, like, where I'm solving some kind of problem. Then I'm much more likely to stay up late than if I start like winding down at 10 p.m. Then I can fall asleep at sort of a normal time for me. But after 10 p.m., I'm really in the danger zone. I
actually try and go to bed by 10 p.m. And that works out quite well.
Yeah, so that specific time will be different for different people. But yeah, I find that like having a point at which I stop working is important for me sometimes, especially when I need to make sure that I get sleep. Or I always want to make sure that I get sleep, but especially when I can't sleep in.
Yeah.
So another one is I find that every night, if I stay up too late, there's always a time when like I start getting hungry again and I want some kind of snack. And if you hit that time, it's really hard to go to bed. Like you don't want to go to bed hungry because then you like wake up hungry too. And so I always want a snack, and that keeps me up for like another hour at least when I might not have wanted to. So, trying to get to bed before that time where you start getting hungry, I think can be really useful. And then one of my final tips is my brain responds to like something called ASMR. I think it stands for autosensory meridian response. And what that means is that there are certain things, like certain sounds and certain motions that cause like an intense, like very relaxing brain tingle in my head that really like blisses me out, which is really good before going to sleep. And YouTube has a lot of ASMR videos. Like some of my favorites are like watching someone fold towels, like just like very intentional hand movements. Oh, it's great. Like crinkly sounds and things like that. That's great. Some of them might seem a little bit weird because like one of my triggers, that's what they're called, and a lot of other people's triggers is like whispering. So if someone like watches you watching a video where someone is like whispering things to you, it's a little bit weird. It seems a little bit weird.
Yeah, I just Googled it, and one of the top videos is sensational mouth sounds and breathing, ASMR.
Yeah, if you do not get ASMR, it's going to seem very, very strange to you. But if you're someone who has, at some moments in your life, experienced this, like I remember the first time for me was when I was at someone's birthday party. I think my cousin's birthday party when I was 4, and someone's uncle, I think my cousin's uncle, came by and sat at a table where I was sitting by myself and didn't say anything, but just picked up a piece of paper and started making some origami. And I just like watching him make the origami, and then he just like put it in the middle of the table, and it was great. I had such good ASMR. So check that out. You may get into it. If you don't get into it, it's going to seem weird. Sorry.
I feel like with every episode, I get to know you a little bit more. And I hope
whether you like it or not, some people really get ASMR from Bob Ross. So if you're an American and you grew up watching Bob Ross, which I did not, but I've seen it since then, and I do get some ASMR, like the way he's soft spoken and like the very deliberate like hand movements and the sounds of the brush and things like that. That gives a lot of people ASMR.
That's fair. I always just assumed he was a meme. I never watched the actual thing. I didn't know it was a real thing, but it is. And it's very cool. It's a very cool video. Ed, do you have any picks for us?
Yeah, so one of my picks is my book that I mentioned earlier, Testing Vue Jest Applications, which I have been writing for nearly a year now, and it's nearly ready to be sent off to production. I think it's going off to production next weekend. So that's really exciting.
Yeah, so this will come out in about 2 weeks. So by the time people listen to this.
Oh, perfect. Well, it's already out now on an early access program. So you guys can purchase a copy now if you'd like to.
Nice.
And yeah, my other pick was this library called JS CodeShift, which I've been using recently. It's basically a library to do large refactors on a project. And what it does is it goes through all of your JavaScript files in a big project, and it gives you the ability to make edits by changing the AST, the abstract syntax tree. So it goes through a project, finds JavaScript files, converts them into AST, and then you can manipulate that AST and do your refactors in there, and then it'll convert that AST back into JavaScript. So if you want to do a refactor where you change maybe the name of a module that you're importing, and you don't just want to do a find and replace or run a regex because you could accidentally change something that isn't an import, you can use this JS CodeShift, write a transformer that only changes import statements, and then run that against as many projects as you like and safely transform your code. So I've got really into that recently.
That's awesome. And lastly, my picks. I have two. One is a little controversial because it's a post that is titled, it's by Brad Frost, and it's called, it's by Edd Yerburgh actually, and it's called "The React is Just a JavaScript Myth." And it goes into detail about there's a common phrase that people say, or people often say, that React is just JavaScript. And he goes into detail that React is much more than just JavaScript. It's not a diss on React. It's more just that React does a lot more than just JavaScript. And so it goes into detail on that. And the reason I say it's controversial is because the comments are quite extensive and very, there's some angry comments in there. But I think what he says and his comments are very interesting. and opens up for it. It allows for a very interesting discussion around that. And my second pick is a talk that was given at Bang Bang Con, which is a conference run in New York out of the Recurse Center, which is a retreat for programmers, which I guess I will add that to my picks as well. The Recurse Center is really awesome, really cool. And anyway, so Bang Bang Con is just a conference where people talk about really cool programming things. And there's one talk in particular that my friend VoV gave about typed holes, which is a functional programming concept. And I don't want to go into detail on that, but his talk, which is called Moving Towards Dialogue, Collaborating with Your Computer Using Typed Holes, is incredibly fascinating. It's only 10 minutes, but it introduces a concept that I had never heard of and I had no idea of. And so I think it's really cool. And so those two are my picks for today.
And sorry, if I could just add one more thing. So I just wanted to stress, especially for listeners, just because like React isn't just JavaScript, again, like Divya said, doesn't mean it's bad. Vue isn't just JavaScript. Angular isn't just JavaScript. No frameworks are just JavaScript. If they were just JavaScript, they wouldn't have any abstractions, and so they wouldn't be useful.
That is very correct.
So it's absolutely good that like none of these things are just JavaScript.
Yeah, I think that was the point, and that was what that post is about. It just talks specifically about React, but I think it can be translated into other frameworks as well, because all frameworks are not just JavaScript. They add extra things on top of it, on top of JavaScript. And so there's a lot more abstractions to it. And with that, we conclude this episode of Views on Vue. Thank you for joining us. Until next week, enjoy the view and Finn.
Bandwidth for this segment is provided by CacheFly, the world's fastest CDN. Deliver your content fast with CacheFly. Visit CACHEFLY.com to learn more.